So we will discuss today about climate change mitigation and the way forward. So we will see how this whole phenomena of climate change is happening across the world and what is the way forward to deal with this. So if you see this word cloud, okay, well it is a collection of several terms and several activities and phenomena which are occurring in and around actually this topic. So well it gives us a sense of this thing how complex this whole process is, this whole phenomena is. So it is very difficult to uh, deal with this, but yes, there are actually solutions. Well, of course, the direct ones is to cut down the emissions, okay, reduce the resource consumption, okay, and then try replenishing and restoring the actually natural resources in their place, okay. Well, apart from these, the major ones, there are several other small scale efforts which you and me can take at our places, and we can help restoring this actually whole devastation which is going on at the global level. So let's see actually this slide over here. So this talks about our personal choices, okay, with which we can reduce this contribution to the whole climate change, to this whole actually phenomena of this climate change. So there are several actually small everyday activities which are listed out in this actually diagram over here, which talk about what is the percentage, what is the a contribution, okay, it is making in this overall this phenomena, okay, and how rectifying on them with the help of that we can actually give our contribution in not making it worse. So if you see this on this x actually dimension, first of all it talks about upgrading the light bulbs, okay. So and this data is actually taken from the average values for the developed countries, so based on the current emissions. Okay, so the first one it talks about upgrading the light bulb. Okay, so we saw in the a previous lecture what is the difference of a power consumption, okay, between bulb incandescent bulb and the LEDs and LCD. So LED is the current actually trend. Okay, with this technology we are saving tremendous amount of energy, okay, and we are getting light by investing a very little energy into this. So maybe if one incandescent bulb used to take 100 watts, so the one actually teeny tiny this LED consumes even a fraction of 1 watt, okay. So in just 100 watts, okay, in just the power consumed by one incandescent bulb, we can have hundreds and thousands of LEDs running in the same amount of energy. So the second one comes a hang dry clothes. Well, uh, how much difference it can make, okay, one must actually will question by hearing actually these things these are so small things to be taken consideration for, for example, these are very normal activities what we actually carry out in our everyday life in our houses, okay. So as simple as one small activity like a hang drying a clothes. So what happens when we dry our clothes in the dryer? Let it obviously it consumes power, okay, and all of these machines, they are not they are all actually in and around they consume power of around 2000 watts, okay. So 2000 in 2000 watts, just imagine how many LEDs we can run in 100 watt, okay, and what will happen in the 2000 watt, okay. So if you see at that scale, okay, there may be thousands and thousands of LEDs which can run, okay, in that actually the same amount of energy which we are using for drying our clothes, okay. And well, drying a cloth is not such a difficult actually task, okay. It can easily happen in the outside in the open air, okay, which we have been, our families have been doing it traditionally for a very very long time, okay. We, all of these appliances, they have come very recently in our lives, okay. But even if they have come it recently, they have had a very lasting, very catastrophic effect, okay, on the whole phenomena of this climate change which is occurring across the globe. So this has some effect, and the equal amount of effect is there in the recycling also. If we recycle stuff and then comes a washing clothes in the cold water instead of the hot water, because again heating the water from the cold to hot, it's going to consume the same amount of energy, because all of these heater rod and heating rods are also, they consume approximately like 2000 watts. Okay, so again the same like a similar amount of like energy, even little more than the drying ones, they are going to consume. And then the next one, if you see, replace typical car with hybrid car. Well, a typical car actually runs on like hydrocarbon based fuels, okay, petrol, diesel, gasoline, etc. But a hybrid car actually utilizes both systems. Okay, it has like a battery powered system also, which it runs on like a generally. But at the time of ignition, or if like the battery runs out of like the power, then it switches on to the hydrocarbon. So to minimize the consumption of hydrocarbons, the use of this hybrid cars these days is most utilitarian actually approach in the automobile industry. And then the next one, eat a plant-based diet. Well, we have discussed in the previous lectures like how the processed food, how the like a red meat, how the high fat actually content based actually foods, they are actually a lot more actually energy consuming actually things. Okay, so how by depending more on the like increasing the volume of our dependence on the vegetable based actually diet, how we can minimize the energy actually consumption. So this is actually more than the previous ones. So well, our we can certainly, we should think of our improving our like food habits and the items which we generally keep in our diet. And next to this, if you see, switch electric car to car free. Well, if it is needed, of course we need to go for these, like we saw in this trio electronica. So in that actually slide, I talk about like even if you need it, okay, you first you try to avoid it, then you go for the efficient one, then you go for the like a renewable one. So it is like that. In case like if it is not like a necessary to have like to own a personal vehicle or to utilize a personal vehicle, we must switch over to the public transport, because to see the amount of actually contribution it's going to make in this overall like a climate change. And buy green energy these days actually energy is also which is being produced from like a different like a sources. Well, the conventional sources are of course the like a hydrocarbon based and coal based, hydropower based. But these the new generation actually energy resources which are like a renewable resources, those are like a solar power plant based, hydel energy, and these wind farms. So these actually we can, if we source our energy, so somewhere we will be contributing in the safeguarding our like a climate. And the next to that is like avoid one transatlantic flight. Well, it seems very like a catchy, like a, but avoiding like unnecessary actually flying will save a ton of like carbon emissions, because even like we saw like in the overall like carbon emissions like per flight between New York to San Francisco, it exerts a lot of like carbon dioxide. So avoiding actually unnecessary actually consumption, unnecessary flying will improve this actually quotient significantly. And then live car free. So if we are living in a, like a neighborhood, if we have to travel for like nearest locations, okay, we can I think go for like a much greener options such as like a cycles, bicycles, okay, or tricycles, to in order to avoid actually the personal transport. And then the next one, like it talks about controlling the population. Okay, as we saw, population is the single largest actually culprit. Okay, because the number of mouths are increasing, the number of feed is going to increase certainly. Number of like all requirements are going to succeed to increase. So as a like a final this suggestion in this slide, it talks about reducing the population. So having a fewer number of like kids and children in a per family, I think is going to certainly decrease the number of like the rate at which the population is growing at this point of time. And once the population is stabilizes, I think we can still learn to manage the resources in the supply whatever we have on this planet. So these are the actually tentative ones, okay, which we discussed over here, like how we as a, like a unit families, unit individuals can contribute towards safeguarding our like a climate change. Because the more we go, more we involve into such activities, our higher input of actually higher contribution will be there in like in terms of like impact of the carbon dioxide and other emissions. So like if we see like what are the strategic options what we have at like a different levels. Okay, so at the region wide, at the upper catchment in the south of the region, okay, gold fields, broadcast farming in the west, okay, irrigated areas of the northern plains. So it is taken from like a one particular place which talks about the the strategic options what we can adopt in the different like a places, different like a geographical places, and what are the key actions which can be taken up for the overall improvement of this whole thing. So in this one, if you see in the region wide, here it says research and development. So how we can go for developing improved land management options that maintain and improve the natural asset based on the future climate change, including extended periods of reduced rainfall and extreme climatic events. So the knowledge brokering, the coordinate information provision and delivery across agencies and institutions. North Central CMA to play the lead role in the provision and integration of climate-related information across the NRM sector. Capacity building, North Central CMA to continue providing support for increased community participation in NRM and asset production under the variable climate change. So if you see like the discussion, the point over here is to manage the natural resources through local authorities and manage them properly so that they serve the purpose in a strategic manner. So how a region can play for the improvement, for the safeguarding of the resources which are available in that particular region. So this actually a slide over here, it talks about like a different strategies and the action points in the like a country of like a USA, and like how they are dealing with it, how they are strategizing on the different like aspects of sustainability locally over there. So state-wise how they are going about it, the place-wise how they are going about it, and what are the action points actually divided by it. So why not we can make such efforts very very local, very very rooted to the place in Indian context. So why can't we have like a strategic action points for our Indian states over here? Because on the same lines we can take care of our the local resources of that place. We can devise like a strategic developmental like a processes, how we can go about it, guidelines, etc. So here if we see like on the broader scale of like a climate change, it has a major actually the impact wise like a three types of like impacts. So one is the very direct impact. Okay, like weather is one of the examples. It has become like these days a very extreme weathers. Okay, so either it is getting very hot or either it is getting very cold. So in these are actually very direct actually impact, direct repercussions of this climate change which is happening at the globe level. And heat waves. So nowadays, several swaths of land, several regions of the like a country and the world, they are experiencing actually heat waves. So we are experiencing actually heat waves and the dust actually storms which are starting in the Saharan region, which is coming through across all the Gulf countries and which is reaching even till the like India. So in some months we experience like a dusty, brown, orangish skies which is filled with this fine dust which is traveling from the Saharan region. So see this kind of actually effects are actually taking place, and it is becoming like so frequent these days. So these are actually some of the direct impacts of this climate change which we are experiencing, which as a earth, as a one unit we are experiencing these days. Then wildfires. Well, several parts of like USA, California and these states, they have been experiencing wildfires very long time. And recently, in the last summers in the southern hemisphere, Australia has experienced like wildfires for a very long period of time, and it's a huge swath of land. So a lot of like a vegetation is gone dry, and a lot of like animals and other wild species have been killed, and such as like a catastrophic effect. Even there was like an effect observed on the human settlements also. Several of the colonies and settlements, villages and towns have been kind of caught in the middle of those fires. And the kind of exhumes and the smoke and dust which has risen out of that has traveled to the several other countries, for it has traveled for the thousands of kilometers, okay, filling sky with the smoke and dust. So these kind of actually events which are causing like a disastrous event, they are becoming like a frequent, and more in the number. So several different kind of like a catastrophes, for example, like a flooding is happening in not so like a regular places where the floods used to happen, like Rajasthan, which was considered to be one of the dry states, is almost flooding like every year or every second year for the last several years now. And the areas of recently there was this flooding in the areas of Jaipur and other like nearby towns, near cities, and a catastrophic situation was actually arising. So these are the some of the direct disasters which we actually are experiencing these days. The second this thing comes into this is the impact through like a natural system. So what are the impacts which are happening through like a natural systems for the like a climate change? So like air pollution. So as we saw, like there is a lot of like a exhaust which is going in the air, a lot of like a volcanic eruptions, a lot of this wildfire. So these things are adding like a fine dust and a particulate matter in the air, and it's causing like a havoc on several like industrial sector. For example, aviation is one of the like a suffering industries of like this air pollution. So in some of the cities this air quality has reduced like so bad, like it is very unhealthy and unsafe to breathe in those cities. So air pollution is one of the major concerns. So for example, here it is very important to mention the city of like Beijing, the city of New Delhi, and several other cities from across the world which are like experiencing very bad on the like air pollution front. And there is a pollution happening in the food and water based like a contamination also. There are a lot of like hazardous waste and toxic substances, being left out in the like open like cycles, and they are reaching to the like aquifers, they are reaching in the like agricultural fields. Okay, they are getting into the food chain. Okay, they are consumed by like the fish. Today fish is eaten by the humans, so we know like how the concentration actually of these substances, okay, are being found these days in the human body. So this is reaching through the like a food chain, through the like a food, through the water. So this is becoming very critical actually these days to safeguard ourselves from like such catastrophic effects. Then the third one in this actually category talks about distributional shifts of vectors, host, and pathogens. So currently our world is suffering through, is undergoing through this pandemic of this COVID, which originated in China. So how these things are spreading across the world? Well, this is the first such instance which has happened at the same time across the globe. Okay, I think earlier also there are some incidences recorded of like a pandemic, but they have actually remained concentrated to maybe one country, one region at maximum. But for the first time now, the whole world is suffering because of this virus, which emanated in the country of China. And now the whole world is suffering. There are lakhs of people who have died already, and there are crores and crores of people who are still suffering, and the entire humanity is at the risk of getting infected with it. So like how to handle actually such like vector borne actually diseases and pandemics is one of the challenges, okay, which are arising out of this climate change activities also. Like how the things which used to be like a concentrated into something like it is being postulated that how this virus actually got transferred from the like a wild to the mainstream like a life of like animals. So the animals who are like living close to the like humans, okay, so this virus actually got transferred from the wild animals to these ones, and now it has spread to the humanity. So how this can be actually so this is one of the like indirect actually causes, like how a pandemic can how such kind of like a medical or health emergency can rise out of the climate change. And the third one actually talks about like impact through like socio-economic systems. So the food and water security, as the number of people, as the number of population is rising, okay, there are several instances of like we have several examples of some countries which are falling behind in in being able to provide food and shelter to their citizens. Their economy is at a very bad shape and they could not actually grow. So even if they are able to like safeguard environment in absence of like such industrialized activities, but the repercussion of like not having any industrialized activity on in their land is to not to being able to provide food and shelter and basic necessities like fresh air and water to their citizens. So it is very unhospitable, very like inhuman kind of conditions has arisen in some of the countries out of this like a climate change. And arising out of this some indirect indicators are also there in form of like a conflicts arising due to like a resource scarcity, like there are fights happening these days in some places, and it's between happening in between like two states who are sharing a river, and between two countries who are sharing a river. So a lot of like such tensions are arising out of this climate change, because the overall water flow and water the volume of water is day by day is getting like decreased in those rivers. So it is anticipated that then the coming like decades and coming like century, it may create a very serious situation for the humanity over the just one simple issue of like availability of water. And then the as a resultant there are a lot of people being displaced due to this lack of like any economic activity or lack of any growth and development in some particular regions. So a lot of displacement, a lot of migrations are happening, and as a resultant the humanity at that place is experiencing like some traumatic conditions, very some mental disorders. Okay. And it's having like a overall like a effect in all like aspects of the life. It's fairly it's doing fairly bad. So like how does this one simple like a chain event of this climate change can have impact like so varied, which can be like a direct, which can be like a through natural system, which can be like a indirect through like a socio-economic systems and all that. So these are actually the diverse nature of this actually phenomena, which must be actually controlled. So if we see like all of these events, they lead to the level of like a socio and behavioral context where there is some amount of like some incidences of like a disturbances recorded across the world, and it is taking toll or direct like a human health, and overall the health of the like a human being or health of the like a that ecology, health of that place is overall impacted. So how this phenomena can be stopped, can be actually reduced, okay, is the actually matter of discussion over here. So if we see like how uh, the if we see in this particular slide, it talks about the poor are not always the most heavily affected by like a carbon taxation. So the burden of carbon taxation on households by income quintile, if we see percent of household consumption. So if you see like there are three countries have been taken for the example. The US, the public in the US, which is like a poorest, and the US the public which is in the richest, then China poorest, China richest, India poorest, and India richest. So here if you see in the US, the US poorest is having this carbon tax is very high, near to like a 4 units of this ton carbon tax in a year to like a 2030. It is being estimated that this is the kind of like impact they may be exerting in this year, in the next 10 years from now. And the US like richest, they are close to little over like a 2. On contrary to that, well, China is topping with almost crossing this limit of like almost near to like a 5.5, and China richest around 3.6 or 3.7. India poorest is doing it quite fairly like low. So if we see the impact caused by like poor people in India, so and the contrary to the people, the poor people from like US and China, it is the lowest. Okay, so it is quite like a kind of a contrasting actually graph over here if you compare between US, China, and India. So then India's poor are doing like a fairly like a low carbon taxes. This thing in the year like it is projected in the year 2030, and India richest, they are closing around 2.8. So this is one of the like a contrast to this thing I actually thought of like putting up with you, so that you have this understanding like how these efforts what we are talking about at the like a climate change mitigation and all, so how these there is some impact being experienced by the people of like a different like economic strata. So what could be the mitigation and adaptation to the climate change? Okay, so well, there are some very direct and evidenced actually strategies which we can employ actually for this change. So the one comes on the mitigation. First and foremost is of course the energy efficiency. So energy actually, we are today's economy is actually power hungry. We need energy for running each and everything. For whatever we see around us today, we are actually surrounded by the goods and products which are manufactured from somewhere, from some company. Okay, they have traveled from some from somewhere, they were sourced from actually some different locations, some very remote location elsewhere, and they were manufactured at some place, and they were actually brought here for our like consumption. So each and every of this stage of this process consumes energy. So saving on energy is the first and foremost actually effort or the strategy which we should adopt for the reducing this climate change repercussions. And then the next one comes in the energy, like going for like a renewable energy sources. For example, we have the surplus supply of like a sun. Okay, so we need this strategy to devise actually catching the sun's energy to utilize for like our everyday actually activities. So going for like a responsible energy resources is one of our very important points which we must actually uh, catch to. And then comes the electrification of like industrial processes. So how they the heavy industries, how the like normal industries can go for like electrification, because in absence of electrification they use several other actually methods for like they conducting their processes. And while doing so they end up exhuming the or the emitting a very toxic effluents, toxic like gases, or byproducts. So how by integrating actually those processes with the electricity, we can improve upon this scenario. And of course the transport transferring our transport system on the electricity. So if we our transfer our these engine based these hydrocarbon based actually engines on personal transportations on the electricity based actually motors, then it will be very beneficial for the environment, because if the energy is coming from the renewable resources, and if we are removing the hydrocarbons, then the overall actually the carbon emissions will go significantly low. So these are actually some actually points related with the like mitigation. And on the adaptation part, like how this can be done, so stage wise, I would like to like discuss over here, like a more facilities and more infrastructure should be actually designed, should be like a fabricated, which can actually harness, which can generate actually electricity on their own, like net zero energy building we were discussing. So why not to design and build such actually facilities in large numbers, so that the buildings can go independent of the grid. And then restoring the landscape, okay, so that these lands can be used for afforestation. We can have a natural a breathing lungs, the area of these breathing lungs of this planet can be increased for like a fresh air. And we know like a forest reduces all sorts of like pollution. It reduces the soil pollution, it reduces the noise pollution, it reduces the air pollution, because all of this vegetation, they help in filtering these actually emissions in several ways. And well, of course, we have been for some time discussing about improving our like habits of the like food items. So that also has a lot of impact on the overall climate change and mitigation. So why not to improve our behavior? Okay, why not to improve our diets? Why not to go for it? Why not to consciously make this decision and move for the like a vegetable based diet? And then research and development, well, it is very important to understand and analyze this scenario at the world level, at the local level, at the regional level, so that the strategies can be adopted at those respective levels to help mitigate actually this problem. So these are the actually some measures which we can take as a like a preventive and precautionary measure. okay, beforehand, because we have some data. There are some agencies like IPCC and UNFCCC, so these agencies actually conducting R&D to analyze the impacts of the like a climate change happening across the world. They have data sets available for even like a country wise. Okay, so why not to utilize these resources and work for the climate change and mitigation? So how these can be done in like a phase and sub processes for the like throughout this adaptation process. So if we start from the top, this the detect the problem, what is the problem area, gather the information and knowledge around that area, try to understand that whole phenomena, where what is happening, how is it happening, where is it happening, when it is happening. So all of the W's and H's. So if we inquire about them, we will have a full set of like data which can be processed for like a further defining and redefining the like a problem. Okay, then we can develop options to deal with them. Okay, we can assess those options, like how we can go planning around them. Then we can select some applicable options, we can go for like action points. Okay, we can implement them, we can monitor and assess, and we can manage like how it is performing. We can have some assessment and evaluation at the end of it. We can again rectify, we can come back, and we can begin the next cycle. So this is how actually we can go for this climate change mitigation and this activity at the individual as well as the national and regional levels. So we must go for like a such a this thing. I would like to mention over here, if you see that the distribution of world's water. So why I brought this, because water is one of the very has become a very scarce resources these days. It is not readily available, and several of our like states and cities and towns are experiences this actually a trouble. So how small this how the quantum of this fresh water which we as a human and the other animals can consume is so little compared to the salt water, the ocean water on this planet Earth, that you will feel like astonished. So that's why actually I brought this slide for your understanding. If you see the total water distributed around the like a planet, if you see, so the units you can see in the first column, distribution area, this is like a in the kilometer square. Okay, so 10 to the power 3. So with that number, if you see, is the 5,10,000. The total fresh water available is only like 1,49,000. Okay, the total world's ocean is like 3,61,000. So the total fresh water available, if you see, is very little compared to the total water. Okay, so only this is the water which we can actually make use of. Okay, so the if you see of the total water percentage, this total fresh water available on the planet Earth is only 2.53%. Okay, so only with this 2.53%, we have to undertake all our actually activities, everything. Okay, and then the further distribution, you can see like how this water is actually scattered around the planet, in which form, in the rivers, in the like freshwater land, in the wetlands, in the glaciers and all. So we can see like which area requires like what kind of like attention for like the water preservation. Yeah, so satire, you may have seen like a such climate based actually issues and satire. So this is a satire which talks about it's Santa, so it must be true, climate change evidence. Well, Santa is forced to hire a camel because there are no more ice caps and very cold regions where the reindeers of Santa can survive. So now he has moved on to a camel. Well, it's in our hands, so we must work for it. Each one of us has the potential to contribute at our own scale, so we must work for it.